Is perhaps a first for Play the Game. We're joined here today by a distinguished panel and soon to be joined by Andrew Zimbalist. I first have an announcement that has to do with these little cards that you have in your packet. This card is for tonight's dinner. If you don't plan on being able to, if you cannot attend tonight's dinner, will you please take your card to the front desk where Maria is, where you signed in, and leave it for somebody who can go. And if you don't have a card, go there and see if there's a card that somebody's given so that you can attend tonight's big party. You won't be disappointed if you do. So that's the announcement. We also are joined by someone who's not in your program to be a part of this panel, and that is by Christopher All, who will offer here his commentary and or insights of living for 40 years in the United States. Not as somewhat an outsider, but now enjoys an interesting status of insider-outsider perspective. So we'll begin on time now, and our first speaker is Dave Ridpath, who's going to talk to us about alternative models of sport development in the United States, particularly with respect to the educational system. Yeah, great, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for getting up this morning to listen to this great presentation on American college sport. I'm Dave Ridpath. I'm an associate professor at Ohio University in Athens, Ohio. For those of you, it's not the Ohio State University, it's the other one, the oldest university in Ohio, so I have to always state that we're about 70 miles south. What I want to talk about today is I'm going to shine a bit of a spotlight, as Kim said, on college athletics, but I'm going to expand that a little bit more today. I just finished a 15-month sabbatical at the University of Bayreuth as a Fulbright scholar. And the main purpose of my research project there was to look at the European club sports system and ascertain if there might be a similar system or model or models that could be conceptually developed to take to the United States, propose, and implement over however much time, generational, immediate, however you want to put it, implement it to take stress off our educational system. We are the only country in the world that has almost 90%, that's according to the USOC, United States Olympic Committee, 90% of our sports development grounded within the educational system. That's mass participation, recreation, and elite sport development. However, our model is broken, and I want to start today by telling you where I come from in this. I worked in intercollegiate athletics for about 15 years. I'm a former NCAA First Division, Division I wrestling coach. I worked in intercollegiate athletics administration, and I used to be probably the most jaded supporter and cheerleader of this system. What I have found by working in the system, essentially getting forced out of the system, and now being a critic and reformer of the very system I used to support, is the way we have a saying in America, if you have a favorite restaurant, never go in the kitchen to see how they cook things. Well, in college athletics, I went into the kitchen, and while it sounds on paper very good to have sports and education together in this sense, hey, even from a higher education perspective, that you can get a college scholarship, you can play your sport, and you can go on to a happy life, that is merely a facade. So I start at a baseline, where as a reformer, I'm not going to entertain any type of tweaking, tinkering at the margins. This is a system that, although I'm not going to compare it directly to FIFA and some of the other organizations that we have discussed over the past couple of days, it is a system that is broken, it is a system that is inherently corrupt, and it is a system that needs to change as it is damaging the very fabric of educational primacy in America. So, here's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to give you just a little bit of historical background that most of you already know, why we have the educational model in America, and then the purpose of my research and really what I came up with. Essentially today I'm going to tell you that as my research continues to develop, I have conceptually put together 4 potential models that we can use in the United States, either in combination or in singularity, instead of our educational-based system that we have. how we're going to fund that, the potential health and competitive benefits. Okay, so again, not to give you a history lesson, some of my colleagues up here are going to talk a little bit more about this and give you a little bit more in-depth picture of the National Collegiate Athletics Association, which is the primary sports governance model for college sports in America. So I'll skip this a little bit, but essentially, sports started the same in America, with students developing sports to blow off steam, essentially from their academics and other things, workers from their kind of tough blue-collar life. Those sports were organized in the educational system because we wanted to keep control of them, as opposed to in Europe, where people wanted sports outside and separate from the educational system. In many ways, it almost happened by accident. Then, of course, a couple colleges decided to play each other in certain sports, whether it was rowing or football, and presidents and alumni and others said, hey, this is great. We can actually make some money off of this. And so it grew into what we see today. Again, as I've mentioned, we've talked about completely dismantling scorched earth strategy with FIFA. I believe we're at that point with educational-based sports in America. So again, that's my baseline argument. I don't want to do any tweaking. It is time to do radical surgery on our current model. As I've mentioned, this does impact education. We have put competitive and elite development of sports at all levels, kindergarten through 12th grade, even in certainly in higher education. We have put competitive success, revenue generation, and winning much above educational primacy. Also, I need to make it clear that this model that we have in America now is not going to last very long, and this is where I think Andy and Roger are going to talk about a little bit, is our current model is under siege through the legal system, the government system, through reformers like myself and other groups, that this system we have is going to change whether we like it or not. I think we need to be better prepared and have at least some conceptual models that we can go to, and not act like this model is going to go in perpetuity as is, because it will not. It will change based upon the economics and other social reasons. All right, so purpose of research, I wanted to examine, of course, the European club sports system, also look at a complete change of our educational model within America, because this system, is going to change. And I do believe that as we continue to be insatiably thirsty for winning in football and men's basketball, we will continue to put money into those two very commercially successful sports, and other sports will continue to suffer, and they will not have places for mass participation and elite development in America, which will hurt us in national and international competitions. Obviously, the popularity of football and men's basketball is not likely to change, and so we have to come up with some other models to combat that. All right, so here's the four models that I've come up with. We'll go through real quick. Here's what I call them. Proposed Model 1. Again, Andy Zimbalist is going to talk about this a lot more. He and I have worked with a group called the Drake Group. We're part of a working group that has put forth a congressional bill that has talked about essentially what I call extreme alteration of the current model within the educational system. I still believe it's important to look at, can we keep sports within education, but also balance them properly. Proposed Model 2 is an academic, athletic, commercialized solution. Model 3 is what I call the hybrid model. That's more so where the European club sports system starts to manifest itself. And then Model 4, which I think, however unrealistic, we do have to look at a generational change in America of potentially lifting and separating schools and sports. So let's just go through the models real quick. All right, proposed Model 1, I mentioned who I've worked on this with. Mainly what this consists of is what we say college sports are. This is what's so amazing about this, is we claim that college sports are about education. So why not create a model where it actually is college students playing college sports, and education is the first priority, and athletics would be an extracurricular activity. Not that you couldn't have mass participation, even elite development, but I do believe if we enforced a true college education sports model, other systems similar to what you see here in Europe would begin to manifest themselves anyways. That's why this model actually really excites me. This is something that could be done rather quick. If it is implemented, I do believe that there will be athletes, coaches, potentially even schools that will say, We don't want to exist under this strict model. I go back to when Janet Evans, one of our most famous swimmers at Stanford University, decided to drop out of school. Not that she didn't go back and finish, but she dropped out of school back in the early 90s because the NCAA implemented stricter practice time standards. Not that they're followed, by the way, but Janet Evans said, I want to be an elite swimmer. I need to be able to train 50, 60 hours a week, whatever it may be for a swimmer. So Janet Evans was able to do that. We do have rudimentary anchors of a swim club system within America, so she was able to do that. And I'm saying that we should have those options and choices for athletes and not have so much of our sports embedded in the educational system. Some of the other things, again, Andy's going to talk about this more in detail, but the main thing from this model is we want to bring together a President's Commission, an elite blue ribbon President's Commission appointed by the President, whoever that may be. I don't know if we can get this done before the next change, but similar to what happened many years ago with the Amateur Sports Act in America, actually looking at amateur sports, Olympic sports in America, giving athletes a voice, more voice in the governance process, and actually making Olympic sports overall better. I do believe that a commission like that, if we want to have college sports in America, again, grounded in education, could actually be a great thing to get this conversation started. Okay, Model 2, I have to give credit to two of my friends on this. One is Dr. John Gertie, who's been a longtime reformer, but he also was a person who worked within the college athletic system for a number of years and kind of had an epiphany like me in many ways. And then also one of our former high-level administrators within college athletics, the former Big 12 Conference Commissioner Dan Beebe. Their model are similar. It's not really one model that they both came up with, but essentially it is us giving up the fight against football and men's basketball and just turning that over to the schools. So you do what you want with that. You pay the players. They don't have to go to school if you don't want to. No academic standards. We're not going to worry about that. What we're going to worry about are the other sports. If we're going to keep most of our sports within the education system, we need to go ahead and bring those sports back in, give them the mechanism and ability to have mass participation and elite development opportunities. We would no longer offer athletic scholarships. It would be what we call in America need-based aid, because it does cost a lot of money to go to college in America, and you would get money based upon your economic qualifications. We would actually have a similar to Model 1 for all of the other teams, but we wouldn't worry anymore about football and men's basketball. About 90% of our problems, our scandals, our academic issues are within those two sports, and we're going to essentially wave the white flag on those two. Model 3 is what I call the hybrid approach, and this is more of a generational change, but this is actually mandating and creating a separate external club system based upon the fact that the NCAA, National Collegiate Athletics Association, will likely start to drop and allow schools to drop more and more of our so-called Olympic sports, or what I hate to say, non-revenue sports. But that's the purpose. That's why we say that, because we're more focused on our commercially based teams. This is a way to have a home for these other sports, actually have an external system to be able to absorb those sports so we can continue to have those elite development, mass participation opportunities. Several things could be done. We could actually have separate clubs outside the school, or we could have clubs that are still aligned with the school. We do have infrastructure in place, much like the time I spent in Germany. Many facilities are already shared between schools and sports clubs. I don't think this would be as difficult as it might sound. And then a couple other things. These clubs could, even if the football team wanted to have a club, this club can be external, but pay the school for use of their logos, their marks, their names. There's all kinds of ways where this can be done. Model 4, as I'm being told, I'm a little pressed for time, but this is real quick. Again, obviously a huge generational change, but I do think that it has to be discussed. Should we look at potentially a long-term plan of actually lifting and separating sports from our school system in America and getting back to where schools are grounded within physical education, limited intramural and extramural functions, but most of mass participation and elite development happens outside of the schools. How are we going to fund this? Well, in America, we don't like to pay taxes, right? One thing I learned in my time living in Europe, most of this is not a secret to you, but I found out that healthcare actually isn't free. I really enjoy our presidential candidates saying, healthcare is free in Europe. Why can't it be free in America? Well, I got my paycheck in Germany and I was in about a 52% tax bracket. Okay, that's a little bit different. Now, somebody like a high roller like Andy Zimbalist is probably in a 36% tax bracket. I'm probably in a 28%. So we don't want to usually pay that type of money to provide health care. But I would say that we should explore potential government funding of an external club system, at least partially, because what I do like about the European healthcare system is you focus on prevention more so than reaction to health issues. And we saw a lot of this yesterday during one of the sessions where it talked about that physical activity and engagement in physical activity can lower healthcare costs by billions of euros. And I do think that the government in America should get involved in that. We do a lot of public-private partnerships. I think this would increase volunteerism. We have a lot of philanthropic efforts that I think that could be redirected from intercollegiate athletics to an external type club system or a hybrid approach. And I think obviously these clubs, like clubs in Europe, could have ancillary businesses. They also sell tickets. They have sponsorships. There are ways to fund an external model if needed. Okay, obviously big health and competitive benefits to this, which I've mentioned already. We have a public health crisis in America. Mentioned in Europe, you're trying to get people to move more, to participate in sports. We don't even have the access and ability in America that you have here in Europe. Many of our sports programs are being dropped in schools. Physical education programs are being dropped. We have to look at this also from a public health impact and looking at other sports development systems to help give that a positive, to have a positive impact. All right, so again, we have to be prepared for the changes that are sure to come. Again, it's not a matter of if the American sports development system and education is going to change specifically in college sports. And I do believe we need to start in college sports because the changes will trickle down. If these positive changes were made, it would trickle down to the primary and secondary levels of college education, of the education system. But I do think that we have to look at this from an approach that the current model does not work, whether it's in kindergarten through 12th grade or in higher education. But we also have to recognize that we need to look at alternatives, or the system itself is going to implode and we might end up with something that none of us like. So with that being said, I'm being told I need to wrap up. I'll look forward to your questions later, so thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Lots of food for thought. We will have time after a coffee break at 10. The coffee break is at 10:15, as you see on your schedule, to come back and revisit some of those provocative ideas, provocative and sound at the same time. Next, Roger Pielke will talk to us about making sense of NCAA as a governance problem. Thanks, Roger.
Good morning. I originally titled my talk The NCAA for Europeans. And I've looked at my time I had available, and 15 minutes is not a lot to talk about the NCAA. Up in the upper left there you see Boulder, Colorado, where I'm from. Beautiful place. That's the campus, that's the university at the base of the mountains. And what dominates that picture is that stadium right there in the, right there, it's a stadium. It's a football, American football stadium. It's a little bit larger than the Etihad Stadium in London, where Manchester City plays. It is entirely normal and not unusual to have a giant stadium in the middle of your college campus. And for most Americans, the National Collegiate Athletics Association is almost invisible, particularly if you're a creature of the academy of universities. It's just there. And every day I walk past a giant stadium. Jens Sire Anderson came to Boulder last year to visit, and I took him around to all of our athletics facilities, to the football stadium, to the basketball arena that seats 13,000 people, to the recreation center that has indoor hockey, indoor soccer, maybe 7 basketball courts, a swimming pool in the shape of a buffalo, seriously. And to see how my campus looked through his eyes was eye-opening for me. The NCAA is an association. It's a member-based association. The members are colleges and universities. It's more than 100 years old. It was created about the same time as FIFA, interestingly. And it was created at the outset to standardize rules of competition but it emerged out of crisis, and the crisis was violence and injury in the sport of American football. And one of the things that I cannot emphasize enough is the cultural significance of American football in the U.S. sporting landscape, and particularly at universities. So what I'm going to try to do in the next hour, briefly, is just to give a sense of some of the issues facing college sports in the U.S. It's a complicated issue, and people don't agree on actually what the problem is or if there's a problem. Therefore, they don't much agree on whether action is needed, and if so, what sorts of actions are needed. So I'm going to give you a few topics, and I put it together with this short word that you can interpret that as you will, adrift, so you can remember what the key issues are: amateurism, dollars, rules, isolated, football and basketball, and Title IX. So the NCAA, this is from their website, it is based on the idea of amateurism. And of course, like we've seen in the Olympics and other areas, there's no such thing as amateurism. And there's no such thing as amateurism in the NCAA. It turns out amateurism is a rule-based idea in the NCAA. Students who participate in sports, particularly big-time sports that attract attention, have always been compensated by the NCAA. It may be a legend and it may be real, but the very first intercollegiate competition was a rowing. It was a race, rowing, in the 1860s. And the legend is that Harvard went down to the docks and paid money for a big, strong worker to come and row for their team. In 1907, the captain of the football team for Yale had corporate sponsorships. The coach of Harvard at the time was paid more than the president of Harvard. Money has always been part of the NCAA. Because of that, the NCAA standardized, put rules in to create this idea of the college scholarship in the 1950s. The idea was that, all right, we'll compensate athletes, and we're just going to limit it, nothing more. I'll talk a bit about that. But the idea that should athletes be paid or not be paid is kind of a false issue. The question is, should they receive a paycheck? They are for sure compensated. The head coach at my university, University of Colorado, is a guy named Tad Boyle. He's a great guy, super smart, works hard, and he goes into homes and tells prospective recruits, you're going to get a scholarship worth $250,000, which is basically 5 years of tuition plus benefits. So college sports was the start. This is from the 1890s. I think this is an Army-Navy game, and you can see the stadium is full. The players are pressed for reform. So on the left, that refers to Northwestern University, which is a private university in Chicago, where football players appealed to unionize. That was basically tabled by the National Labor Relations Board. A decision on the merits wasn't given. There's a lawsuit that still is active in the U.S. Related to the image and likeness compensation for players. So this is a video game that has college players. It doesn't have their names, but it has their shapes and their faces. And college athletes thought they ought to be paid for it. This shows the 10 most watched television programs in cable television history in the U.S. So that's 30 million people, so more than 10% of Americans. This is the college football championship game last year. And so of the 10 most watched programs, 7 of them are college football games. Here you have some NFL games. The recent Republican debate that had Donald Trump would be on this list somewhere about 7th. So college football dominates TV. This is the revenue that the NCAA basketball, every spring there's a big tournament. This is $800 million. It just shows how the TV contracts have increased over time. The current contract is $10.8 billion. So the difference between college sports and professional sports, from the perspective of television revenues, is not particularly different. For all intents and purposes, the college sports, men's football and basketball is a professional entity. Coaches get paid a lot. So this is the head coach of Michigan. He gets paid $8 million a year. And as a professor, I can tell you that's a little bit more than professors get paid. Not a lot. Here's Alabama, Texas. USC, Steve Sarkisian, he gets paid, or I put it past $4.25 million. He just lost his job for showing up drunk on many occasions to work. It's a different world, the coaching. Many of the assistant coaches get paid millions of dollars also. This is a neat graph. This shows the highest paid public official in each U.S. state. If it's blue, it means it's not a coach. Otherwise, they're all coaches. One interesting fact is that the three highest paid individuals in the U.S. military, so the U.S. military with all its might, aircraft carriers, nuclear weapons, not a general, not Joint Chiefs of Staff, it's the head coaches of Army, Navy, and Air Force. Highest paid. R is for rules. So the NCAA has a lot of rules. In 1952, it had a rule book. There it is, 25 pages. And today it's well over 1,000 pages. A lot of what goes for governance in the NCAA is compliance and enforcement of its many, many rules. And a lot of times what you'll read about having to do with the NCAA are programs or students violating the rules. It's interesting, but I think to focus on compliance with the NCAA rules is to actually fail to look at the entire system. But that's what a lot of attention goes to, and it's enormously complex, enormously. Everything from what type and amount of food athletes can eat, to how they behave, how athletic staff interact with academic faculty, and so on. I is for isolated. So this is what I find very remarkable. Despite the overwhelming and significant presence of athletics on college campuses, universities try to pretend that athletics either doesn't exist or it's something completely separate from academics. So we build silos and we create barriers to try to separate them out. I'm in the process of creating a sports governance center at the University of Colorado where we're trying to actually, it's an experiment in real time, but to try to see if we can integrate athletics and academics in a way that isn't done as a new model. This shows the mission statements for a number of universities from Charles Klotfelter, who's written a really great book. And you probably can't see it. This is Extension, Medical School, Journalism, Business School, School of Education, Veterinary, Law School. And what he asked was how many mission statements mention these different activities. At the bottom is athletics. So less than 10% of universities acknowledge that athletics is something that they do, which I think helps us to see but not see the NCAA. F is for football. Let me just emphasize the significance of football. This is from Nick Harris at Sporting Intelligence. It's a total attendance in the world's top sports league. So this is 74 million people attend Major League Baseball in North America. Here's professional baseball in Japan, 23 million. NBA, NHL, NFL round out the American sports. Here's the Premier League, almost 14 million people. Here's the Bundesliga, and so on down the list. If we just open this up a bit, here's college football in the United States, second most attended sport in the world. And here's college basketball in the United States. The purple is women's basketball, and the red is men's basketball. So as many people in the United States attend women's basketball games as roughly go to the Bundesliga. I cannot overestimate the cultural significance of college sports in the United States. It is fundamental. A quick anecdote. In the United States, if you go to the United States, on the weekends you will see that college football is played on Saturdays, and the professional football is played on Sundays. And if you're like me, you grow up, and it's like force of nature. That's how the world works. It turns out that division between Saturday and Sundays was created by the U.S. Congress in the 1960s, where they eliminated the NFL's antitrust protection from noon on Friday to midnight on Saturday, and carved out a television space for college football. It's ingrained in policy, in law, in practice, in culture. All right. T is for Title IX. So Title IX, it's a long story and it's complex. It's not legislation focused on sports specifically, but it has had profound implications for sports. And what it says is that no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So if your university receives federal dollars, which universities certainly like to do, then you have to have what's basically equality between men's and women's sports. That's been the effect of Title IX. So if you go to universities, you'll find that there is a careful balancing between the number of male athletes and female athletes, male teams and female teams. And to a large extent, to the degree that football and men's football and basketball programs do bring in money, and not many of them do, but they help to subsidize often the smaller men's sports and most of the women's sports. This has had a profound effect on the success of female athletes in the United States. This shows the number of Olympic medals from 1896 to 2008. So this is when Title IX was passed and first implemented. Here's the 1980 boycott, so there was no medals. But the introduction of Title IX has led to more opportunities for women in competitive sports and a surge in U.S. medal winning. And I think you can make a pretty good case that there's a causal effect there. It's not just a temporal causation. All right, so amateurism, dollars, rules, isolated, the importance of football, and Title IX. If we were to have a one-day workshop, this is what I would suggest would be our topics. But to give you a sense of the complexity and depth and variation of issues. Here's how you can find me, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, Andrew Zimbalist, will continue the theme, which is to discuss more the crisis and reform in intercollegiate athletics in the United States. Andrew?
Good morning. I'm going to try to complement what's been said already. I have a few disagreements with some of the details, but not with the fundamentals of what's been presented, and we can talk perhaps about some of the small points of disagreement later on. But I'm going to try to focus on the underlying economics that drives intercollegiate athletics. And one of the things that stands out is that even when you look at the most commercially oriented schools, and the NCAA, by the way, has over 1,000 schools in it, and they're divided into 3 divisions. The most commercially oriented division is called Division I, and Division I has 3 subdivisions. The top subdivision, the top meaning the most commercially oriented amongst the most commercially oriented, they're called FBS, or the Football Bowl Subdivision. Within FBS, there's also a subdivision, although it's not a formal subdivision, it's an informal one. Within FBS, there's something called the 5 power conferences. The 5 power conferences are about 65 schools. Those are the schools that are on television on Saturdays. Primarily, it's those schools. Those are the schools that are generating $100 million and more sometimes on their football programs. That's called the Power 5 conferences. Now, if you look at the FBS in its entirety, which this year has about 127 schools in it, you see that the median operating deficit of the schools in FBS was over $14 million. That's for the entire athletics program. It's not for football or basketball, but for all the sports. And many of these programs have 25 or 30 sports that are sponsored underneath them. So a median operating deficit amongst the top schools in terms of their commercial orientation of over $14 million. Now I'm using the word operating deficit advisedly because it generally leaves out capital costs and many indirect costs. The NCAA did a study of the capital costs, or they commissioned a study of the capital costs at FBS universities a few years ago, and the estimate was that the typical capital cost at an FBS university was over $20 million a year. So if you take the operating deficit of 14 and you add on top of that the capital costs, you end up with $30 million plus as a median deficit for FBS programs. Now, one of the things that's been true over the last couple of years, I'm not going to go into all of the details for it, but there's been a realignment of the conferences. Just like in professional sports, teams play in leagues, in college sports they play in conferences. Historically, conferences were geographically defined, so a bunch of schools that pretty much had similar academic qualifications, but were close to each other, they'd be in a conference. What started to happen after 1984, when there was a Supreme Court decision that declared that the NCAA television policy was an antitrust exemption, is that conferences started signing their own television contracts. And more recently, conferences started to set up their own, what are called RSNs, or regional sports networks. As this television product of the conference became more and more significant, and the amount of money that it generated became larger and larger and larger, the conferences decided that they didn't like their geographical bunching anymore. What they wanted to do was to expand their outreach so they can cover more states in the country. The more states you cover, the more markets you cover. The more markets you cover, the more television households there are you can sell your product to. And so what you started to get in the last 20 years is conference realignments. And you have some conferences that have teams that are 1,000 miles or 2,000 miles away from each other. So as a result of those changes, which harken back to the 1984 Supreme Court decision, as a result of those changes, the television rights and the overall revenue in the programs in the Power 5 conferences have been zooming at an unprecedented rate. Practically, they're growing on a per school basis. Over the last 3 or 4 years, they've been growing about $10 million per school per year. Now, what that revenue explosion has done, and it's very obvious to Americans who follow college football and college basketball, what it's done is to raise the issue of why aren't the athletes being paid. Now, Roger appropriately pointed out that the athletes are paid in the sense that they get scholarships. The scholarships, depending on what school you go to and whether you get a degree or not, can be valued up to about $60,000 a year. But they're not getting a paycheck. The debate that we have in the United States today is why aren't they getting paid if the football coach is getting $8 million or $7 million. Plus, by the way, those numbers that Roger put up, those are salary numbers. They're not compensation numbers. Compensation numbers would include benefits and they would include perquisites. And the perquisites are off the charts for these college coaches. The free memberships to golf clubs, $50,000 per year in private jet service, and go on and on. The sort of compensation is actually a lot higher than that. But the question is, schools are generating all this money, $100 million more than that, on their football program, or $20 or $30 million on their basketball program. The coaches are getting paid multi-million dollars. And why is it that the star players on the football team who are putting their bodies on the line, and the star players on the basketball team who are putting their bodies on the line and sacrificing their educations, why are they not getting paid? They're getting a free ride to the university, but they're not getting any paycheck at the end of the day. Why is this? So this created, this commercial explosion has created a lot of concern about the injustice and the exploitation that adheres to our system. Now, the fact that you have, in spite of the explosion in revenues, the fact that you have the median school losing on an operating basis $14 million a year means that there's a financial crisis in the system. Part of the problem is that a football team, a college football team, even though it looks to us as outsiders, this is a highly commercialized activity. It doesn't have any stockholders like a corporation has. And because it doesn't have any stockholders, it doesn't have anybody demanding to see at the end of every quarter profits on the books. If you have profits on your books, your stock price goes up. They don't have that pressure. They don't have that market pressure in college sports. So what happens is their revenue goes up, is that the coaches and the athletic director is the person who oversees and manages the whole department, they say, oh, why don't we build a new training facility? Why don't we put a new level of luxury seats on our football stadium? Why don't we spend an extra $1 million or $2 million recruiting the best athletes in the country? Why don't we try to get a better coach? So instead of paying the coach $4 million, we'll offer $8 million and we'll get Rick Pitino to coach our basketball team. They find a way to spend it because the coach and the athletic director fundamentally are rewarded for one thing, and that's winning. They're not rewarded like a CEO of a corporation by generating profits. The CEO gets a bonus, the CEO gets a better job next time around. They're rewarded for winning. So when extra money comes in, they spend it. That's the fundamental reason why these programs, even the ones who are generating the most revenue, with very, very few exceptions, that they're running in deficit. So it means that there's a financial crisis. It means that the athletic program is bleeding the educational program or the academic program at the school. And so I have here, what are the alternatives then that a typical school has in the face of the financial crisis? Well, one of the things that they can do is they can increase what we call student activity fees. The student activity fees can run up to $1,000 or more. They're called activity fees, but largely it's money that goes to subsidize the athletic program's losses. They can decrease aid to financially needy students. Most universities have an aid program, so if there's a qualified student, an academically qualified student who applies but has low income, and it costs a lot of money to go to colleges these days, they can give them financial aid. So one of the accommodations they can make and have made is to decrease financial aid. Another thing that can happen, and typically does happen, is you decrease your educational budget. There are many schools around the country that are pouring millions of dollars into their football stadiums, and they're laying off faculty members. Another thing that you can do, not very many schools have done this, but some have, the University of Alabama in Birmingham recently did it, is you can opt out of the race. You can say, okay, this is not working for us. Football is not generating the publicity and the fame that we think it ought to be. Our athletes are getting concussed. We have more and more lawsuits against us, and therefore we're going to drop out. And University of Alabama in Birmingham, at least temporarily, there's been a political storm about it, has dropped out of the race. And some schools irrationally decide to double down. And against all odds, they try to get up to the very highest echelons of all of the subdivisions that I talked about. CSU, Colorado State University, recently in Fort Collins, Colorado, recently made such a decision, and they're building a multi-$100-million football stadium on their campus downtown. There are other examples of that as well. Both the previous speakers made allusions to litigations and labor organizing efforts. So I was going to talk about them, but I think that I'm not going to have enough time to go into them in any detail. But basically, what we have last year, the year before that, we had the Northwestern football players trying to unionize. The National Labor Relations Board, as Roger said, basically put that on hold. You had a suit from Jason White, who was a Stanford football player back in 2006. His case was calling for what they call cost of attendance. Cost of attendance allowances for college athletes. When you get a full scholarship or a grant and aid at a U.S. university as an athlete, you get tuition, room, and board, student fees, and basic books, required books. That's all you get. So a lot of poor kids, a lot of minority kids who get recruited to play at the big-time football and college basketball programs are coming from low-income households. And when they say, okay, you have your tuition paid, you have your room and board paid, that leaves them with a lot of expenses that aren't getting covered. They have to travel from their home to the school. They're required perhaps by the coach to wear a tie and a jacket when they have pre-game press meetings. They have other needs. Maybe they want to go to a movie once every 3 weeks. They have lots of other expenses at the school. Maybe they want to buy supplementary books. Maybe they're doing a research project and they want to buy books. So this notion of a cost of attendance, which is not only tuition, room, board, and books, but also the auxiliary expenses that you have, basic expenses for living during the course of the academic year. And the Jason White suit was saying, we want to get some of that money too. you can limit us, you can say we don't get a paycheck, but we want to cover some of these basic expenses. They settled that suit. It was not a very good settlement. So it in part led to the O'Bannon suit, which was, as Roger said, the O'Bannon suit was about the use of the names, images, and likenesses of college players, and they wanted to get the money that was being generated by these video games and the jerseys that were sold with their names, images, or nils, names, images, and likenesses. So that was part of the suit. But the other part of the suit was they wanted to get cost of attendance because that had basically been shunted aside in the settlement for the Jason White case. And they're sort of winning. It's kind of in the middle and it's getting appealed, but that case is still going forward. And now there's a broader case that a very famous sports attorney by the name of Jeff Kessler has brought against the NCAA, saying the whole system is rotten, the whole system violates antitrust laws. They're not going after one little piece of it, but they're basically saying, let's have a free market for college athletes. And the argument here is that the reason why the coaches are getting paid $8 and $9 million a year is because the athletes are not getting paid. You push down, so there might be a star athlete on a football team that has a marginal revenue product, a value that he produces, that might be $2 or $3 million a year, and you're giving him a scholarship that's worth $50,000 or $60,000. And so what happens is by not paying the athlete his full value, the coach who recruits the athlete is the one that gets paid. Kessler's saying the whole system is rotten, we should get rid of it, and basically just turn it into a free market for college athletes. That suit is out there. How am I doing on time? I have 2 minutes left. That's not good news. What should I say? So, look, as a result of many of these cases, the NCAA has tweaked the system. They're starting to make incy-bincy reforms. It's a little bit like 2020 that we talked about last night with the IOC. You have to preserve the underlying business model, so you make some small concessions. The pay-for-play model, which I think on a model of justice and a model of how economics works, it makes some sense. There are problems with the pay-for-play model. The problems are that the system doesn't have money to support it. Eventually, in the long run, athletes can get paid the extra money that's getting paid to coaches and the extra money that's going into the facilities. If you can't pay the athletes to attract them to your school, pay the coach a lot of money. Famous coach, the athletes will come for that. Or give them a great big fancy football stadium. The athletes will come for that. Over time, what will happen is the coaches' contracts will expire, 5- and 10-year contracts will expire. The football stadium debt will be paid off, and you'll have some money around to pay the athletes. But in the short run, there's not enough money in the system to start paying the athletes, so it would crimp the athletic budgets a lot more. Another issue is that you would totally change the culture in the university. American universities don't use the price system, don't use the market mechanism to allocate resources. If a student takes my class, or wants to take my class, and I have 30 seats in the class, but 40 students want to take it, I don't use a price mechanism to allocate the 30 seats. I don't say, who's going to bid the highest to get in my class? You get into my class based upon other criteria, like are you majoring in economics? Have you taken the necessary prerequisites? And so on and so forth. So I think that it really upsets the role of education and the nature of student culture to say, okay, let's just pay the student athletes. Let's deal with it in that way. I think there's a much better way of handling it, and this is something that was alluded to earlier. And that's a system that says, let's reinforce our commitment to academics, and let's bring everybody under the academic umbrella. The way that the Drake Group is purporting to do that, is suggesting it be done, is by granting the NCAA a limited antitrust exemption that would enable it to control coaches' salaries, that would enable it without fear of litigation to say, you can only play so many games during the season can only stretch over so many months, and you cannot play games on Tuesday night in the middle of a work week at 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock at night, and you cannot travel these distances. But to carry out reforms that would emphasize the educational primacy of what people are at the university for. There would be many ways to organize the system so it would be beneficial to the NCAA, it would be beneficial to the student body, and it would preserve the revenue flows that are necessary to support Olympic athletics and also Title IX gender equity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. And again, a number of things things that we could come back to after our coffee break, but our next speaker now will switch gears a little bit and talk about baseball, and this is Rob Stein. Sorry.
It's all right, I don't mind. Steen, actually. Day to day.
Sorry. All right. Then tell us what you're doing.
Okay, no problem. I am going to talk about baseball.
Okay,
Absolutely.
good.
You're all right. I'm just wrong running with it.
Sorry.
I'd like to start with an apology, to be honest with you. You're not going to need your eyes for this one. You just listen. For various reasons, apart from my first page, which wasn't put up, I'm not going to. There's no PowerPoint, all right? Many apologies. There is a first page. George F. Will and I, both journalists. George F. Will, however, is not someone, despite all my defensive attitude towards journalists, protecting them, such company, he's not someone I find easy to admire. On the plus side, he's a man of deep convictions, a fearless, well-informed, Pulitzer Prize-winning syndicated columnist who has been seeking to inflame and re-educate readers of the Washington Post since 1974. On the downside, he's a regular contributor to that noted home for right-wing ranters, Fox News. All the same, there is one issue on which George and I are firmly as well. Intriguingly, perhaps perversely, he was one of the more fervent supporters of free agency when it arrived in baseball in the mid-1970s, setting a precedent for so many other sports. The way he saw it, while not even his mother would ever describe him as a man of the left, on this matter he was, he confessed, a semi-Marxist. Sure, he was in no doubt whatsoever that in so-called real life, free market capitalism should reign supreme. On the other hand, he reasoned, the Marxist theory of labour should apply to sport. Such an assertion surely strikes at the very heart of the contention that American sport necessarily mirrors universal perceptions of the American nation. Indeed, the opposite could said be true. Free agency, player drafts, union power, revenue sharing, all staples of Major League Baseball and the NFL, are profoundly socialistic in essence. Last week, I asked my sports journalism undergraduate students, first years, whether they thought sporting achievers deserved their often enormous financial rewards, or that they are overpaid. The general response, initially, perhaps unsurprisingly, was a bit grudging. One described their wages as extortionate, though once corrected, he did confess to meaning exorbitant. I then posed the question again, but not before pointing out A, how hard these goal scorers, etc., had to work for their money, by comparisons with, say, Tom Cruise or Steven Spielberg, or Jay-Z, B, that their supposed co-entertainers were actively seeking to stop them earning it, and C, that their careers were usually brief and often hindered or halted by injury. This time, when I asked the question, empathy was rather more widespread. As someone who has spent much of his working life talking to young or youngish athletes, I can't say I wasn't delighted. All the same, when I proposed this paper to the conference organisers, one reviewer suggested that the world's poor might not be all that impressed that there are sports folk out there earning more in a day than they will see in a lifetime. To which I can only respond thusly. Sachin Tendulkar, and to only a slightly lesser extent, MS Dhoni, are regarded as national heroes and demigods in Indian villages, even though their earnings on the cricket field have been colossal by any standards, let alone those of a nation where millions are denied so many advantages that those of us in this room take for granted. Tendulkar and Dhoni, and dozens more, had lifted Indian cricket to unimaginable peaks. Sporting success, a stranger for so long in India, had raised national self-esteem. Indeed, for all that it has repeatedly been unmasked as a den of corruption, the Indian Premier League, the most profitable start-up league in sporting history, I believe, home to the game's fattest salaries and fulfiller of so many fanciful dreams, continues to attract vast interest. Now back to baseball. In 1994, the Major League Baseball Players Association, long the most strident union in sport, went on strike, famously succeeding where 2 world wars and a depression had failed by causing the cancellation of the World Series. Now it is preparing for October 2016, when the current 5-year collective bargaining agreement with franchise owners expires. For Tony Clark, the coming year's negotiations will be his first as the union's executive director, the latest successor to the late, great Marvin Miller, whose exclusion from the game's Hall of Fame continues to be a source of shame for the journalists who vote for such baubles. In the back of Clark's mind, I suspect, one question will probably nag above all others, namely, should we risk alienating the public yet again by requesting a bigger, more fitting slice of the pie? They certainly have a strong case, in my view. The average Major League salary on the opening day of the 2015 season exceeded $4 million for the first time. 4.2 million to be precise, up 6.3% year on year and 15% on 2013. League revenues, however, are rising at double the rate. 2014's $9 billion was 13% up on the previous year. Moreover, since 1995, according to Forbes, revenues have surged by 321%. The question, unpalatable to some, is this. Even amid an era of unprecedented salaries and an ever-widening gap between rich and poor spectators, are the athletes who generate those record revenues getting a fair deal? As befits North America's first major professional team sport, the battle for players' rights has been fought most persistently and strenuously in Major League Baseball. That it should become the most militant of spectator sports seems both inevitable and just. Those who stood up to be counted, dating back to John Montgomery Ward in the 19th century, were all driven to do so by what some consider the least admirable example of American sporting exceptionalism, the so-called reserve clause, which bound players to employers in a manner that could be characterised as feudal, were that not too weak a word. A graduate of Columbia Law School, who wed a Broadway actress, Ward co-founded the Brotherhood of Professional Baseball Players to fight against the reserve clause, which kept salaries low and made each player his club's exclusive property, forever subject to an owner's whims and liable to be traded without consultation. Ward himself penned the manifesto. Players have been bought, sold and exchanged, he wrote, as though they were sheep instead of American citizens. Like a fugitive slave law, the reserve clause denies him a harbour of a livelihood and carries him back, bound and shackled, to the club from which he attempted to escape. The subsequent shift in the balance of power has been quite astonishing. Since Marvin Miller was hired by the Baseball Players Association in 1966, no fewer than 8 Major League seasons have been interrupted by player strikes. And in the most damaging instance, as we've seen, even curtailed. That was in '94, following a dispute over the proposed introduction of a salary tax, designed to punish the rich, but ultimately, or so the Players Association argued, to the detriment of the players. The fans were livid with both sides, quite understandably. To them it was billionaires versus millionaires. The next season began with nothing resolved and scab players on the field. Not until President Clinton intervened was a settlement reached. Yet ironically, Nathaniel Groh, an associate professor of legal studies at the University of Georgia's Terry College of Business, believes that a salary cap, long since introduced in the NBA and the NFL, could now be the solution. In 1995, by way of compromise, the Players Association approved what they called a luxury tax, which requires franchises to pay a penalty of as much as 50 cents for every dollar spent on player payroll over $189 million. But this led to the big market teams in New York and California becoming, as Grove puts it, more financially prudent. Since '95, stresses grow, Major League Baseball's overall league revenues have increased nearly 650%, from around $1.4 billion to over $9 billion last year. Over the same span, payrolls have increased by 378%, i.e. barely half as much. At first glance, as Grove concedes, an increase of $2.5 billion in salary divided among roughly 1,200 players doesn't sound that bad. We should all be so lucky. Yet viewed as a percentage of overall league revenues, those salaries, as he warrants, have been decreasing at a rather startling rate. After peaking at just over 56% in 2002, those salaries now account for less than 40% of league revenues, a near 33% decline in a dozen years. As a consequence, player wages now account for just over 38% of MLB's total revenues. A figure that, even 10 years ago, argues Grove, would have been unimaginably low. The most surprising factor in the players' withering share of overall league revenues, emphasises Grove, is the recent explosion in television revenues. With Major League profits from broadcast deals tripling in recent years, there was an understandable assumption that teams would spend more on players. The reality is that teams have little motivation to use their television revenues to increase payroll. Unlike ticket sales, long-term contracts mean that broadcast revenue is fixed. So while franchises can increase profits by spending more on players, and thus improves the team's prospects of success, the same is generally not true for television revenue. In other words, teams have little incentive to spend any added broadcasting profits on payroll because, in economic terms, the added TV revenue has not adjusted the team's marginal revenue product. Furthermore, the players' declining share of revenues, as Grove reinforces, reflects the prevailing trend throughout not only professional sport but society itself, with workers gleaning a declining proportion of corporate profits, while a handful of the wealthiest, such as the baseball franchise owners, are carving up an increasingly disproportionate share of a far from humble pie. In 2001, player salaries accounted for more than half the league revenues across Major League Baseball, the NBA, and the NFL. Their current share is less than 43%, a drop of more than 15%. Major League players, furthermore, have gone from receiving the highest share of overall league revenue in the United States, 3 major sports, in 2003, to the lowest a decade later. Now, I appreciate that some of you may be struggling to find much sympathy for a group of handsomely rewarded athletes. So consider the cricketers who represent the otherwise fictitious entity known as the West Indies. The team that, not so very long ago, was the envy of the global game, not to say the standard bearer for black sporting pride. A year ago, to October 2014, while touring India, the West Indies players packed their bags and flew home at their own expense, landing the West Indies Cricket Board, to whom the players are contracted, with a bill for $42 million from the Indian counterparts to cover the loss of media rights fees and so on. Concern spread to such an extent that Erwin Larocque, Secretary General of CARICOM, the 15-strong association of CARICOM governments, entered the fray, sending a letter to the Indian board proposing a grand settlement. The reality, as he pointed out, is there's no way the West Indies board could pay that $42 million, nor that the CARICOM government would be doing so either. The players nevertheless had their supporters. According to their unsigned contract, they would have to contribute a substantial percentage of their income, up to 75%, to players at lower levels, players for whom professionalism had become a desperately insecure and meagre existence. The senior men were quite happy to help where they could, but felt not unreasonably that they were being asked to bear an unfair burden. Now, it should be emphasised, to those of you unaware of the game's economic model, that cricket differs from baseball and every other team game for that matter, in that domestic competitions since the Second World War have in the main attracted paltry crowds. This is a significant element. The international game is what is important. The international game is what generates the money. There's a big contrast. The players, I'm trying to make the broad point here, whether they're baseball players or they're cricketers, deserve immeasurably better treatment. How many of us in our own jobs would accept a pay cut to benefit lower paid colleagues? Exceedingly few of us, admittedly, earn remotely as much as a couple of the West Indies players who also play in the Indian Premier League, but they're the minority, a very small minority. By the same token, how many bankers or surgeons are queuing up to take a pay cut to help nurses, let alone clerks or porters? Generosity is generosity. The bottom line for me could not be clearer. In the centuries-old struggle between management and labour, across all major professional sports, the players, emboldened by free agency, agents and endorsements, are now asserting their rights as never before. Witness the cancellation earlier this decade of an entire National Hockey League season. And the management, not unnaturally, doesn't like it one tiny bit. That's why, for me, if the Major League Baseball Players Association strike over their share of the profits they alone create, even if it means cancelling my favourite sporting event, the World Series, which began last night, I know which side I'll be on. Thank you.
Thank Rob Steen, the panel, and especially Rob Steen, for his flexibility at my error. Next is Benjamin Bendrich, who will again broaden our perspective, keep the perspective broad, and with a focus on the NCAA, but from a European perspective.
Thank you very much. I want to welcome you all to my presentation, European Perspective on Current Issues of Intercollegiate Athletics. My name is Benjamin Bendrich and I'm from the Georg-August-University, Göttingen, Germany. First of all, I want to introduce my work and the structure of my study and today's presentation. So, over the last 5 years, I've conducted research regarding the support of student athletes. I was interested in international programs and especially the American system and its wide range of current problems. The goal is to learn from the mistakes universities have made in order to develop a new model for student athletes in Germany. Over the years, I've been to several athletic powerhouses in the US, the University of Oregon, the University of Texas at Austin, and the University of Arizona. For this presentation, I've decided to present important findings regarding the support of student athletes in the US from a European perspective, in many ways a German perspective. The following chart represents the structure of the entire study. First, the German university and the German sports system were analyzed. Then the same was done with the American college system. After the structural analysis and triangulation followed. The triangulation refers to the use of more than one method to investigate intercollegiate athletics in order to receive enhanced results. The study reveals new facts about the US system. First, experts in the US were interviewed regarding the current status of intercollegiate athletics. With these findings, a questionnaire for the German student athletes at US universities was developed. Over 160 German student athletes participated and answered questions regarding the experiences at US colleges. The findings are extensive and identify many of the current strengths and weaknesses of intercollegiate athletics. Today I will especially concentrate on study step 4 and some selected findings. But why looking for warnings internationally? Currently there is an imbalance in Germany between athletes who pursue a job training and student athletes who pursue an aim is to get a university degree. Athletes who pursue a vocational training often solve this problem by either finding employment in the armed forces, the Federal Border Patrol, the police, or by working for a sponsor. But a high percentage of elite athletes choose to pursue a university degree university degree. Many of these athletes cannot handle the exhausting demands of the several hours of training per day and simultaneously meeting academic obligations. Under these circumstances, it comes to no surprise that many athletes ask themselves the question, do I stop continuing athletics or do I continue with my academic career? The support program for student athletes in Germany, the Partnerschule des Spitzensports, has failed. Many of the faculty never heard about this program. Clearly, a declaration of intent is not enough. Inside the university, competent contact persons for student athletes are missing. For many German student athletes, the only exit strategy out of this dilemma are American universities and their athletic departments. For American colleges, recruiting international athletes is a growing trend. International student athletes play an increasing role in NCAA competition. Over 17,000 international student athletes competed in the NCAA during the school year of 2009 and 2010. About 500 to 700 German student athletes, A to Z Kaderathleten, that's the German ranking of elite athletes, are active members of US universities. This is by far the highest number of German athletes outside of Germany. The aim of the study step 3 was to identify US-specific problems that are only relevant for the American system, as well as other indicators that can also be a warning or a hint for changes in Germany. In Germany, many people think very positively of the American college system, although intercollegiate athletics in the US is in a crisis. With the help of extensive literature research, the following issues and many were identified. So on the left you can see illegal recruiting, the one-and-done phenomenon in basketball, amateurism, the athletes' rights, the exploitation of ethnic minorities in basketball and football, the role of boosters and alumni, for example, by paying athletes money, tax exemptions for ticketing of stadiums, high-profile versus low-profile sports, the salaries in athletic departments, the structure of the NCAA and power structure within the universities are problems that are specific for the US and don't play a role for Germany. But there are also some problems that we can learn from. For example, enrollment, the commercialism that's involved, scholarships and the length of the scholarships, the clustering that takes place, academic integrity, very important that the faculty participates in forming a new program, competition between universities. There should be no one-dimensional focus. The support programs and services can be, in some part, a positive example and the proximity of facilities. In the first part of my triangulation, the quantitative research, experts in the US were questioned based on guided interviews about current problems of intercollegiate athletics and the perception of international student athletes as well as German student athletes. Findings suggest that widespread problems, especially in high-profile sports, occur. Especially entrance procedures, this includes recruiting and admission, eligibility, are a problem nowadays. The US is the only country to recruit talented athletes without fulfilling established entrance standards. The result, often underprepared student athletes arrive at college that then don't complete their study. Also, in high-profile sports, exploitation of student athletes takes place. The extreme form of commercialism is seen as a major problem for intercollegiate athletics by the experts. In high-profile sports, often academic clustering takes place. For example, in 2011, 62% of the UCI football team had the clustered major history, in comparison to only about 5% of the general student body. So often in college, too much remediation through learning specialists takes place, which results in hand-holding and cheating. The experts support the idea of support services on the one hand, on the other hand criticize the employment of academic advisors within the AD, or the athletic department, Experts are sure support services make sense when implemented the right way. One of the most important differences at universities is if the academic advisors are employees of the university, they solely report to the campus. If they are employees of the athletic departments, they report to the athletic department. If the advisors are employed by the athletic department, they feel a constant pressure to navigate all their student athletes through college successful. So there's a conflict of interest. Among all experts, European student athletes were highly valued regarding their higher academic performance. Experience with German student athletes was seen very positively. The aim was to find out more about this phenomenon during the quantitative research. The realization of the quantitative research was very complicated because most universities had no interest in such a project. Also, some of the German student athletes were afraid to participate because they feared sanctions by the NCAA. Most of the German sports federations have no databases on student athletes in the US, so the respondents had to be found by innovative ways. Either university or athletic department databases were used to look for German student athletes, or coaches, athletes, and personal contacts helped to find them. Afterwards, they were contacted via different social media networks, and in the end, 163 questionnaires were completed. The aim of the quantitative research was to find out more about the experiences German student athletes have made at US universities. The goal wasn't to reproduce the findings of the qualitative data, but to receive additional information. The quantitative research was content-oriented and focused on a range of topics. The questionnaire included biographic, sports, and study-specific profiles, the duration of study in the US, time demands of their study and sport, the reason for leaving Germany and coming to the US, kind of scholarships they have received, support services they have used, the academic self-assessment, as well as the official academic performance. Some of the questioned athletes also had experience in both systems, so they had to share their experiences. Today, I want to focus on a few findings. The key finding is that most respondents would not have moved to the US or continued to participate in elite sports without the opportunity presented by American intercollegiate sports. Many of the German athletes especially praised the chance of getting a degree while continuing to train and compete at a high level. Results indicated that the respondents felt the athletic facilities were superior to their options in Germany. German student athletes use the academic support programs regularly, although they are already very good students. German athletes were asked to compare themselves to their American teammates. 64% of the German athletes considered themselves academically sounder than their American teammates. 25% even said that they are the elite of their class. To verify these statements, also the official grades were compiled. German student athletes do surprisingly well and have a grade average, a GPA of 3.53. This average is 0.4 higher than the average of the entire student body in the US and is notably higher than some of the findings regarding all student athletes in the US. 80% of German student athletes praise the academic support services. Although they are good students, they use the different services regularly and state that these support services have a positive effect on their studies. Over 90% demand the same services in Germany. So the German athletes in the US clearly prefer the sports and college system, although many of the current problems are known. German student athletes invest about 20.4 hours into their weekly training. The official limit by the NCAA is 20 hours per week. Some of the students are clearly above this limit. Others probably just stated the limit, and I had also some students who were injured during their time. In comparison to student athletes in Germany, they train at least 1 hour more. German student athletes invest an average of 22.2 hours into their studies. This average is clearly above the average of the American student body. According to the American Enterprise Institute, today's students only invest about 15 hours into their studies. This shows that German student athletes are motivated academically and want to pursue a university degree. 37 athletes also have a side job, although this is officially prohibited by, or some of the jobs are prohibited by NCAA laws. According to the German student athletes, support services like academic advisors, only if independent from the athletic department, are helpful. Physiotherapy, medical support during their studies is praisable, and also some of the life skills courses can be helpful. Whether academic support services make sense is an ethical question. Once found important, there is an ethical obligation to assist these students to be successful and become important members of university and society. The US shows that lowering the academic standards is only to marginalize the intellectual enterprise with unshakable consequences. German student athletes prove that academically well-prepared and motivated student athletes can flourish even in the criticized American system. Because of the Abitur, the university entrance exam for high school students in Germany, and maybe we also, because of the one more year in high school, we have 13 years of high school, German athletes often arrive well-prepared at the universities. Often these athletes don't struggle with academic expectations, but rather have to deal with issues like homesickness or a certain culture shock. In both countries, university presidents don't have the power to bring change. Governmental or legislative influence is at least necessary. Also, different conferences and universities need different sports models in the future, like Professor Ridpath already said. So that's something like the hybrid model. In Germany, centralization of student athletes to a few locations in Germany seems to be inescapable. It has to be an elite and select program for academically well-capable athletes, so we don't see the problems of the US. This also shows that even more data is necessary. Only a few studies have been done to determine the impact of academic support. Many major colleges or many major college programs like the University of Oregon have state-of-the-art academic centers, but the question is, have these buildings helped the intellectual enterprise and helped the players to perform better in the classrooms? The effects of close monitoring on athletes' personal development has to examine as well. We don't know, and there's no evidence that monitoring the student athletes helps the overall development. Thank you for your attention. This was my presentation.
So the panel has left us with a number of themes that we can return to. We can get back on schedule after the break, where we will be joined by Christopher All. Perhaps we can contemplate some cliffhangers, such as in terms of equality, whether or not the United States federal government considers college football players to be a third sex, and whether or not, in terms of economics, what the economic rationale is, where management invests millions of dollars in labor who then beat their brains out. We'll be back at 10:35.
Yes, there are a number of universities where teams are either they could be competitive. We are now seeing Birmingham building I've been working in York where they have So we're beginning to see a move, not of course announcement, a lot of universities wanting to they now have the third level of one college. Harvard College the second year, we're still so begin to see that. Yes, nothing to lose, but that's what it's called. Netball was this female. Most of the teams there in Super League are in fact universities. The universities are using that as a program to make students what the Super League netball is not university. So what we begin to see is that both participation, so when I the other day I was doing and they are really doing things where they're saying is to apply first time away from home. The countries of football team, the rugby team, because they're so they're trying to be a horse riding or something else. So the university now saying, so this kind of thing, one of the best sports footballers I've met. Let's do it. Let's do that. There's another company football, because the company football team, which has never played before, but actually is started out with handball. Sports is true for a start. So we now got the German turning up at Scottish University. He's probably now handball player in Germany, but in Scotland he's a star. And you can play handball almost up. You can play handball. So they now realize that we can do that. We can. So this is the danger they have is you end up having the team which is called being in Germany. So you can then competition that we've seen that. But we are seeing a kind of participation, performance, and the participation thing, because more England is probably the actual universities really don't focus on maybe we should do that. Then the tuition fees and also the universities and those students as customers. Both academic fees is also focused that we can't be allowed to professor. Maybe also in the years that doesn't work. But the students say, hang on, I made love the day here, I was service. So one way, where's my phone? They both want academic support as one person. They also want student experience. For many public student experience is being educated at university. We were at Loughborough University, and they get 1,000 papers for today. So the Prime University doesn't play a role. Because even if the university is not the even so, the sporting excellence, unlike the States, is not a place. All students will be able to time to get a job after. That is changing massively. Now, some of the universities may not be like the States, but some of them are because they have to. Oh, good. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Oh, good. Oh, that's great. Yeah, I think, other players
Good session. Well, you know, I lived in the north of this amazing. I'm always curious about what happens there, so. Well, I follow you. Sort of. Many people in Canada, we need that kind of Oh, it's way better. But I think it's sad. The leadership of Canadian Olympic sport are all
Sure, we're going that direction. I'm not. I'm actually trying to say that could happen. That really want that to happen.
Is there a movement now?
well,
I don't think I know, I'm always like, so when you get back to that,
Yeah, nice to meet you.
I'm not saying that you work for something that's not worthy of it. You may not want it. I would just say, well, start. So, being the critical choice, maybe you want I guess if I may choose what you think about it at this point in time. No, I really do. It's funny because we often talk about that one. Well, that's but then something happens and we're okay. What Amy said was talking about. And just this year, we're allowed for there was a college athletes are essentially $2,000 to $5,000, depending on the based upon
on how it works.
Okay, thank you so much. I hope that was a good night. It was very good, yes. Don't give me my card if it shows up anywhere, let me know. Okay, I can retweet it out. Okay, thank you. Oh, that's a lot. That's Bobcats. Bobcats, yes, very good. You know your stuff. But I always say we're not the Buckets. That's what everybody thinks. Yeah, I have to battle. Can't make it. Don't cut.
So welcome back to the fourth quarter, where Chris All has won the toss and chooses to kick off. He will start us off with a few commentary insights, and then we'll resume. Chris, it's all yours.
Thank you. Well, as I think some of you may have heard it, listened when I was discussing international handball yesterday or in previous conferences. My situation is that 40 years ago, after having been immersed in an American sports system across the waters here in Sweden, as a referee, player, administrator, coach, I had to adapt to a totally different setting in the United States. And as I stayed on there, and now I've been there for 40 years, I guess I am now just as immersed there, with sort of the adaptation in the sense that there are a number of things that I found strange from the beginning that are now perhaps found more natural and positive. But also conversely, that are a number of aspects that I have never quite been able to appreciate or see as positive. And of course, my perspective there has been that of sort of being a pioneer, trying to make, excuse me, the totally foreign sport in America, handball, an Olympic sport by all means, but as the Brits may have ruined for the Anglo world, with very little a modest existence in a country like the United States, and therefore seeing what struggles there are if you are not part of the traditional American sports scene. Now, to my mind, it should be obvious for those who genuinely study the American sports scene, and particularly the heavy reliance on the educational structure from high schools and particularly through colleges, that some of our speakers were already indicating some severe flaws and really need for major changes. But that is not what you typically hear about so much in the American debate. You hear about people having concerns about very specific aspects, some of which were already mentioned here. But the notion that you really need some major overhaul and a new approach that focuses more on providing opportunities for both talented athletes and those who would fit in more under the rubric of mass participation outside the education system. That is not what you see too much about. So my first observation from what I've heard so far today is that I'm really delighted that people with the insights and clouds like Andrew and Roger and Dave are indeed focusing on that, and that one might see some hope that one day we will get a modified system that better suits the large numbers of not necessarily potential star athletes, but those who through their youth want to get into the habits of their own direct participation in sports for a lifetime. Because that is really not what the current system provides, and that is perhaps one of my main concerns. That we see the glamour and excitement and the hundreds of thousands of spectators in the big college games. But it will be an illusion to think that that really implies great opportunities for all these students to get involved directly themselves in sports. The other thing, of course, is that I've sort of had little optimism about change, because I think more than I have seen in other parts of the world, the American sports system is based enormously much on traditions. That, for instance, when you struggle with a small sport like handball, you come up against this. But this is not an American sport. Why should we make room for it? You already have the sports we need and want, and we don't really care much about what's important in the rest of the world, what's included in the Olympics and so on. So for me, I've been sometimes jokingly saying that, well, you know, the important concept in American society of religious freedom, that to me sometimes seem to amount to having a choice between becoming a fanatic baseball or supporter or a fanatic American football supporter. Now, in the debate about what's wrong in college sport, I think you heard several of our speakers comment that there's the question of, are we doing an injustice to these basketball and football players who are really instrumental in creating the kind of revenue and creating the enormous business machines that are attached to these many of the universities? Shouldn't they get more of a share of the income from those tremendous business operations? To my mind, perhaps that is somewhat a wrong question. Benjamin perhaps touched on it more, and one can raise the question. And isn't it rather an injustice that academically poorly prepared so-called student athletes get these scholarships that we were talking about, $250,000 worth over a 4-year period, on account of their ability to play basketball or football, when you have thousands and thousands of much more academically talented and suited students who are much more deserving of these scholarships, but have no chance of getting their hands on them. Also, I think it could be useful to expand on one aspect. One of the speakers mentioned Title IX, the legislation that required equitable treatment of women in the context of college sports, and that has led to an upswing and opportunities in many sports for American female athletes that has had its impact in Olympic medal counts and so on. One particular observation there, I think, is that for me was interesting, and that we tried in some way in handball to piggyback on, was the specific impact that has had in women's soccer. I think most of you sitting here are well aware of, I would say, dominance of United States in women's soccer in recent time. In a sport where, to some extent, it's the advantage of competing with soccer powers like Brazil, Italy, Spain, where they still by tradition and prejudice see it as a men's game, a prejudice that never quite existed in the United States in the first place. But with this focus on Title IX, where precisely soccer became one of the opportunities for universities to find this focus on how to spend resources on women's athletes, that really has had an impact. And finally, I want to comment that you might think that some of the negative aspects of what the focus on having sports opportunities provided primarily through the educational system, that they could be offset if the US Olympic Committee had an emphasis or a focus that somehow supplemented or complemented what is provided through the university sports. But the reality is that for the most part that is not the case. And again, if I use the example of handball, but it applies equally to many other sports. The US Olympic Committee, compared with many of its counterparts in Europe or elsewhere, takes a totally hard-nosed approach that their financial support is available to some extent, which may sound a bit strange, to those who already are somewhat able to support themselves through their own funding efforts. And above all, it's reserved for those who are showing very strong chances of gaining Olympic medals. But the ones who fall by the wayside through sports being handled primarily by the educational system, or fall by the wayside because there are no traditions for the particular sport, even if it's on the Olympic program in the United States, they also are given a cold shoulder by the Olympic Committee, and it sort of becomes a double whammy. And there is, like in handball, sort of the meager flow of athletes who have become rejects from the US college system because they didn't make the college team, or they were good college athletes but never quite made it to the ranks of the professionals. And I'll stop there because we now mainly want to give you an opportunity to pursue your questions and clarifications.
Thanks, Georg. Thank you for the insights. There are obviously a number of themes there that we can pick up, or others that you've thought of over the course of our distinguished panel's presentations. So could I open up the floor for questions? And if you raise your hand, when you ask a question, could you please, as has been the case in the last few days, identify yourself and tell us to whom your question is pointed. And one further thing, one question at a time, please. Too many rules? Sorry. Laura, thank you.
Laura Robinson from Canada, and I think Rob or Dave and Andrew probably are best able to answer, but others could too. It's going back to Title IX, and two things thinking about it. First of all, in terms of what happened at the University of Nebraska, where girls who alleged being raped by players were able to use Title IX successfully legally to say that the university had an obligation to protect them. So I'd like maybe you to comment on where that is going, but also the latest way in which Title IX is being used by the Department of Education in terms of them making or trying to make the universities reach a level of safe campuses for women in terms of the male athletes.
I mean, I can answer a little bit of that, Laura. I mean, obviously, Title IX has been fantastic for female athletes from a competitive standpoint, and access to scholarships, access to a lot of things. From the perspective of protecting our female athletes and the culture of entitlement that many of our male athletes have, and also what I would call the rampant protectionism of some of our athletes. And I dealt with this myself and unfortunately participated in it when athletes would get in trouble on campus, oftentimes, especially if they were elite athletes. A whole different system of protectionism and obfuscation took place. And I think the real issue is, as I've always tried to preach now that I've had my epiphanies, is we need to treat our athletes on campus as we would any other student. If a student on campus is accused of rape or sexual assault, what are the steps and procedures for that student? And what the steps and procedures are not getting a battery of lawyers to come and basically shame the victim in this case and protect the athlete at all costs, or somehow manipulate the legal system so this young man might be able to continue to play so that the team can win. So I think the best way is you follow Title IX as written, but you treat the athlete as you would anyone else. And I think everyone would accept that. If someone is accused of a crime, if normal person is having to follow some procedure and that means they get kicked out of school, banned from campus, that's exactly what should happen with the athlete.
So can I add that Title IX says that there can't be gender discrimination. It doesn't say there can't be gender discrimination in athletics. So the policy espoused by Title IX around sexual violence applies broadly to all students. And the basic concept, as I understand it, is that when students are sexually harassed on the campus, that they can't partake fully in the activities and the resources that the campus makes available. So an atmosphere of sexual harassment contravenes the equality that Title IX seeks. Let me just say one other clarifying thing about Title IX with regard to athletics, which is that it does not require equality in resource endowments for men's and women's sports. It requires that either that there be a proportional representation of athletes that's similar to the proportion of students, but then they give a leeway, usually of 5 or 10 percentage points. It varies according to who's running the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education, or that the school fully meets the needs and abilities of the underrepresented sex, which is very much subject to interpretation, or that the school has had a history of improving the participation of the underrepresented sex. So it's been said a few times at this conference that Title IX mandates equality. It doesn't do that. It has certainly furthered justice and equality, but today about 43% of the athletes in college sports are women. Women are about 55% of undergraduates. That proportion of 43% has been stuck there since the end of Bill Clinton's presidency, or it's varied a little bit here and there. But I think it's just important to underscore that as positive a force and wonderful a force as Title IX has been to promote women's sports, it has not brought us to equality. And if you look at not just participation rates, but you look at expenditures in women's sports and men's sports, the divergence is much, much greater.
Thank you. For Laura to follow up on that and to Andrew's point, so, and also for all of us to sort of contemplate is the idea that Title IX, as Andrew points out, has been widened, certainly under the Clinton administration, to include things like sexual violence, but for everybody who's a visitor to campuses. So it's not just an athletic or it's not just a student issue. And it's been more interpreted for people who identify in all kinds of gender-specific ways. So it's not just any more discussion about males and females. That's kind of old. So thanks. Yep.
Thank you. My name is Brighton from Ridpath High School in Copenhagen. And my question is mainly for Dave Ridpath. Thank you for a very inspiring presentation on how to enhance mass participation in the US sports system. Question number one is, what is the worst problem for the mass participation strategy? Is that political or is it financial? And if I may have question number two, when we see from here, I won't say how can we help you, but should the inspiration comes from, now I'm in Denmark, from the sports club system, or the school physical education system, or both? How do you see that?
Okay, I want to make sure I get this right. So you're asking what are maybe the main barriers to mass participation sports.
Yeah.
And really, in my view, and I think others on the panel can also comment to this, and certainly Christopher, because he has experience in this, but I would look at it as financial first, but also it really is our obsession with the commercial, what we call the commercially successful sports of football and men's basketball. When I was in high school, and I'm only slightly younger than Andy, so when he was in high school too, and Roger's a bit younger than both of us, but typically back when we were in high school, you even had what we called sub-varsity teams. So for instance, I went to a very small high school. We actually had 3 levels of football, which now doesn't exist at my high school. We only have one football team, a varsity team. We don't have a freshman team or a junior varsity team. So we are getting away from physical education and sports development at the primary and secondary level. So a lot of these teams and sub-varsity teams that encourage mass participation are going away. Many schools don't even offer physical education anymore. I would like to see our schools go back to that, where physical education is a part of it. Now, during my 15 months in Germany, I was able to see this firsthand, where my kids were actually part of the gymnasium school in Bayreuth, and they were able to, I was able to see firsthand physical education and intramural sports programs within the school, but then they also participated with the local sports club. And then sometimes the school and the sports club shared facilities. But I see it more as a financial, but it's more, as kind of Andy said in his presentation, where we're directing our resources. If we actually marshaled them out and balanced it out a little bit more, we can afford these things, I believe, in the school system. Your second question, I mean, kind of even leads to what I just said. I do think that we need to have more choices. American athletes don't have choices right now. Their choices within the school system. They don't have the choice of being able to go to a local sports club. We have some, what you would call rudimentary sports club systems, I guess, in America, but they're not inclusive. They're very expensive, segregated in many ways. We need what you have here is a broad-based, widespread sports club system with many different sports offerings for all ages. My brother-in-law in Germany, for those of you from Germany would know, he plays on an Alta Herren Mannschaft, the soccer team, or Fußball Mannschaft, and you know, he's 56 years old, you know, and we don't have a lot of those opportunities in America. We really need a sport for all movement like has been happening in Europe. This is generational, though this is more long-term, but I do believe we need to do that. Does that answer the question?
Here and then back there.
Hi, Scott Jedlicka from the U.S. And I think this sort of builds on what Dave was just saying. Some have suggested, Andy Schwartz in particular, that to reform college sports and to perhaps reform amateur sports or sport development in general, that the first step is to lift the regulations on college athletes, and that once we eliminate this artificial control, that the free market will sort itself out. So I guess that's really for anyone on the panel. Are you optimistic about that possibility of lifting this control and having market dynamics fix the system, or is there a perhaps more efficient way than that?
Yeah, so I think the fundamental problem with what Andy Schwartz argues is that it completely ignores the apparent goal, the stated goal of universities, which is to provide education. If you want to bring the market system in here, let the market system work for college football, but let's make it minor league football. After all, one of the big differences between football and basketball in the United States and baseball in the United States that I think Rob left out of his talk is that the minor league system in football and basketball is the NCAA. In baseball, they don't have, well, they have it, but the history is different. Baseball has to pay for its own minor leagues. So whatever the share is of baseball players in total revenue, and I think it's actually 51%, not 40%, but whatever it is, and there's another 4% that they're paying for minor leaguers. If you want to have a market system, if Andy Schwartz wants to have a market system and pay all the players, make it a minor league system. You can still have the Michigan Wolverines as the name. You can have them play in the Michigan Stadium. Some of the Michigan students will go there, but stop the charade about calling these football players students, because 99% of them are not. So that's number one. Number two, as I was suggesting in my talk, there isn't right now the financial resources to simply snap your fingers and say, okay, we're going to pay the quarterback $4 million, and we're going to pay the left halfback $2 million, and the right guard $3 million. There aren't the resources. Now, eventually, there could be the resources once we cut down coaches' salaries to where they ought to be. And they shouldn't be paid more than a college, 5 times or 10 times more than the college president, and 20 times more than professors. So we could save millions and millions of dollars on the full professors, the full coaches and the assistant coaches, and on the ADs if we get their salaries down. But they're on long-term contracts, and there's going to be some cultural momentum issues that you have to deal with. So we're not going to be able to save that money for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. We can't save the hundreds of millions of dollars that have been invested in the stadiums. We can't save all sorts of money that's been invested elsewhere in the program. So there's not the money around to simply do that. I think another issue that's very important is that if you were actually able to make reasonable estimates of the marginal revenue product of players on, say, the Oklahoma or the Michigan or Wisconsin or Alabama football teams, I think what you would find is, if you had an open market system, is you'd find a couple of stars who were generating in value, who had a marginal revenue product on the order of $3, $4, $5 million. And then you find a bunch of players who were still starters, but they weren't stars, who were generating several $100,000. But the average football team in Division I has 85 scholarship players on it. It has another 30 non-scholarship players on it. The vast majority of those players have a marginal revenue product that's below the value of the scholarship that's given to them. So the real people who are getting exploited by the current system, it's a handful of people, they're the stars on the top teams in the country. They're exploited. But frankly, I'm not real worried about them. That might sound callous, but the reason I'm not worried about them is because while they're in college, they're treated like princes, not financially, but in every other respect. And soon they're going to go to the NBA, and they're going to go to the NFL, and they're going to make $5 and $10 million a year. So I don't think we have to worry about them being underpaid during an apprenticeship period of 3 or 4 years when they're getting a lot of branding, when their name is being thrown out there and they have a lot of value. Their nils, their names, images, and likenesses are accruing value over that whole time. I think what we do have to do for those players is make sure that they have a cost of attendance scholarship so all of their costs are covered, number one. Number two, make sure that they have adequate health insurance while they're in school. Number three, give them protection around injuries so that if they have a concussion that prevents, a serious concussion that prevents them from playing in the pros, or they break a leg that prevents them from playing, or they become quadriplegics that prevents them from playing in the pros, that the income that they would have earned in the pros is covered and they can get some of that. Have those kinds of systems to protect them. Also give them due process as students. Also make sure that they get an education and that they're prepared to go to classes when they enter the university. Do all those things for them and not worry about their economic exploitation, which I think is a smaller point given the overall function of the educational system that we're talking about.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, I'll just make a small comment, which we could talk about, but there's no point in even invoking the notion of free market when it comes to sports in the United States, either college or professional. This is one of the great ironies of sports. It's that in the United States, sports is a heavily socialized system. The Bundesliga is far closer to free market principles than either professional sports or college sports in the US. And the idea that you can even approximate a free market in any dimension overlooks 100 years of law, policy, culture that have made these systems fundamentally subsidized. The university that I teach at is subsidized at every level. The sports program is subsidized, but so is the music program. And if we were to do a free market system for sports, you could say, well, let's do that for the rest of the university. Well, then you'd have no social sciences, no humanities, no music. We just don't operate that way. So I think part of that probably reflects a disciplinary difference between some economists who envision what a theoretical free market system might look like, and me as a political scientist who say, well, take a look at the real world, and there's no free market to be found.
The key is where we are. We have to accept at least parts of college athletics are and not what we hope they will be. And that's why, going back to the model that I put forward, maybe it is time. I fundamentally disagree with Andy. I was just laughing up here because he's been sending me email after email since I've been here, Andy Schwartz, about why my opinions are wrong. Maybe we do. Just go ahead and say, you know what? Football and basketball, if you want to be part of the educational institution, like Roger said, you're part of this. This is not free market here. This is non-profit subsidization. We're all sharing in this, but we're going to alter the model that you're currently under with like what Andy Zimbalist and I have worked on with the antitrust exemption and things like that. However, I have no problem with saying, University of Colorado football, University of Michigan football, you are now your own corporation. You're going to pay rent for the stadium, pay fees for the logos, marks, everything else. Do what you want with your players. Every other team is going to fall under the educational model and really be part of what we would call intercollegiate athletics. But if we want to wave the white flag on football and men's basketball, we can do that. However, and this is where I fundamentally disagree with Schwartz, is we're not in the free market, if I'm reading what Roger's saying correctly, and I agree, is we're not in the free market in college athletics. This is higher education, all right? And we shouldn't be paying coaches 5 or 10 times more than the president, those types of things. And so that system needs to be altered. However, if we can't do that, then fine. We're going to turn you into a minor league system. And I think, Scott, as I was telling you the other day, people are going to show up and watch regardless.
Can I add one other thing to this, which is that there are 30 or 40 or so basketball and football programs in the FBS of Division I that operate with a significant surplus, have an operating surplus. It could be 10, it could be 20, it could be $30 million. That money goes to support Olympic sports and women's sports in those athletic programs. If we do what Dave just said, and I don't think it's a terrible idea, but it would be a consequence if we did what Dave just said, which is to wave a white flag and said, okay, we're cutting you guys off, do whatever you're pleased to do. The rest of the athletic program is not going to have access to those resources. Today they have something called the Football Bowl playoff. Last year it replaced this previous system, which is the BCS. That Football Bowl playoff generates over $600 million a year. The Football Bowl playoff, which is a national football championship in FBS, is the only championship amongst 90 of them, 90 sports championships sponsored by the NCAA. It's the only one that is not controlled by the NCAA. All the other ones are controlled by the NCAA, and any revenue that gets generated, and in the case of the March Madness and the men's and women's basketball tournament in March, it generates hundreds of millions of dollars. The NCAA then takes that money and they fund a variety of NCAA programs, and they give 4.5% to Division II and 3.4% to Division III. They don't distribute it quite the way they should, but at least they're distributing the resources that are generated by the national championship. In the case of the football playoff system, $600 million plus, it's all kept by the schools that are participating in it. So we have to be careful as we talk about restructuring, about what happens to the resources that are supporting the rest of the college athletics program.
Thanks. We have one more question in the back, but to follow up on that, as a former Division III athlete, thanks, Sandy, for remembering that we're out there and that, that we have roaring voices as well. Bruce?
Bruce Kidd, University of Toronto, formerly responsible for our intercollegiate programs at the University of Toronto, and as a result always looking across the border at the example of the NC2A. I would say, following Kim's comment, that our fears are about the NC2A Division I model, and to the extent that Canadians who've gone to the United States return to Canada, they usually do that from NC2A1 programs. But our experience is that Division II and Division III are, on the whole, very well-run programs, and rarely do Canadians return from them. And there are some terrific examples of sport and education in those programs that ought to be inserted in this debate. I put my hand up to ask a question of Andrew Zimbalist, because I'm sorry you went through your slides on the alternatives to pay for play so quickly. because I too support the approach of making university sport more supportive of higher education. And I like your focus on degree completion, workers' compensation, and whatever you call it, the COA, the cost of attendance. My question is about the extent of the distribution of the, quote, free ride. Because in my Canadian experience, while the value of the free ride is much boasted about, many athletes get less than a free ride, a quarter or a half. And at private universities, or even at state-supported universities where tuition has soared, they come back with considerable long-term debt, with none of the Canadian resources to pay that off. What is the extent of the distribution of full-ride scholarships? And do you have any information on the associated student debt of intercollegiate athletes where the full rides are not full? And are there any proposals to address that in this debate?
I'll take a crack at that and then let Dave fill in the blanks. First of all, if I could, before I talk about those who are getting partial scholarships rather than full grants and aid, one of the things that is important to underscore is that by the way, there are different graduation rates, and I don't want to get into all that. We can talk about it afterwards if somebody's really interested. But a fair measurement of graduation rates for Division I FBS football players is somewhere in the neighborhood of 55%. Just a little bit over half of them end up graduating in 6 years. That means that they aren't really getting the educational value that's supposed to be there from their $50,000 or $60,000 a year scholarship. In basketball, the number is considerably lower than that. In terms of who gets partial scholarships, you're right. Outside of football and men's basketball, and perhaps women's basketball, and it's for some cases men's hockey, most of the athletes are not on full rides. Most of the athletes are getting partial scholarships of different degrees. Some might be getting 20%, some might be getting 40%. The NCAA has two different systems for, they stipulate the number of scholarships that can be given by sport, and in some sports they get split up, in other sports they don't get split up. So yes, it's definitely a problem for what we call the athletes, and it's called the non-revenue sports. Many of them end up significantly in debt, but I don't know what the proportions are.
You know, I think it's important to mention that. That's why I think the only thing that I would add is although the scholarship sounds like such a great thing for the athletes to have, oftentimes it has given the coaches and athletics department an inordinate amount of control over the athlete. They're almost using it as a pay-for-play contract, when by definition it's supposed to be an academic award. So that's why, you know, in one of my models I talked about moving to need-based aid, and then following up on what Andy said earlier, which correlates to the extent is you know, how would these sports survive if football and basketball disengaged? You know, obviously it would have to be a huge reduction in expenses, and one of those things would be those sports would be, you would be on need-based aid. There would not be an athletic scholarship. So if you had the means to go to college and you were assessed by the university in the federal formula that you could pay for college yourself, you would pay for college yourself and participate. Others might get a full ride of need-based aid. Coaches would have to have lower salaries, travel could be limited, competitions could be more regional. But the scholarship itself, while it sounds really good, can be very, very problematic because it's been used as a form of control and punishment over the athlete. So I don't know if that correlates, but I think Andy covered it pretty well.
While you contemplate that, a little interjection on student debt. One of the things I discussed with students in my class is about the rising cost of student debt in the United States. It's a growing concern around the world. Students certainly are marching. We think of in Taipei and in the UK against rising student debt. In the United States, the top 10 riots on college campuses in the last 10 years are caused by drunken idiocy.
That's Ohio University.
It's all at Ohio University. Or college football victories.
sometimes correlate together. Actually, you bring up something that may go. When you talk about student debt, and I think it's important what Andy said. There's only a few programs that generate enough money that are essentially separate associations from the institution. Some do. Actually, Ohio State University is one that typically does give money back to the institution. But the rest of us, I always see like the other 80%, Ohio University being one of them, they are over 70 to 80% subsidized by student fees, additional student fees, or other university subsidies. So for instance, at Ohio University and at Kent State, and I know that Kimberly knows this, they're paying about an average of about $1,000 to $1,500 in student fees for just athletics alone. That doesn't include the student center, the library, the medical center, other kind of like an extra tax that, you know, again, the students pay to be part of the university. The largest portion of that fee amount at any university is the student fee. And so typically a student at Kent State or Ohio would graduate with an extra $5,000 to $7,000 on their bill just to support the athletic program, and that certainly extrapolate that out with student loans and other student debt service, it can be quite daunting.
Thank you.
Kelsey Erickson from the US, but based in the UK. Just kind of a comment on that. I think yesterday or 2 days ago, the NCAA or Times Higher Education or something, the average student debt at the moment in the US is $26,000 at the end of graduation from undergraduate, but that's for non-athletes. That's just in general. So obviously it's going up. I do my research in doping, and one of the protective factors that I found is continuing with higher education. I've done cross-cultural comparisons of the US student athletes and UK student athletes, and the systems are very different. As we're talking about, kind of in the UK, they generally skip university if they're on track for Olympics. Whereas in the US, most sports, other than at the moment track and field, you have to go to at least 1 year of university, but obviously that could just be 1 year. Where do you guys see that kind of coming in the long term? Do you think there's risks of separating university from sport in that sense? And that's for anybody.
Yeah, I think you touch on a really important issue, and it goes back to what was talked about earlier about mass participation in sport. If you really want to open up a debate about sports, there's a few things to recognize. So in the United States, most universities used to grant credit for physical education classes. That's dropped from something over 90% to something like 30%, maybe less. People who advocate for sports as part of a well-rounded education say that's a bad thing. But if I say to you, well, let's give university degrees for basketball, or skiing, or football. Universities are engaged in all sorts of vocational education. We give degrees for computer programming, we give degrees for law, accounting, music even. We teach people skills. And so I would say if we value sports, just because you're really, really, really good at sports shouldn't mean that you shouldn't be allowed to get a university degree in that area. So I think there's a huge risk that the university culture, we talk about higher education, and sports isn't part of the higher education, it's lower, that we devalue sports, when everything we do in the United States says exactly the opposite, right? So I think that to the extent that the sports programs become separated off and attached to universities as maybe side businesses or minor leagues, it serves to devalue sports, but it also threatens the value that we place on sports.
Look, if we're going to start giving course credits in basketball and football, or having degree programs in basketball and football, what we have to make sure of is that there's a systematic body of literature and analysis in those areas, so that students, when they take those classes, have to read, have to write papers, have to do critical analysis. And if they do all that, then I agree with what Roger just said. But as far as I know, that doesn't exist right now. I mean, it's possible for an individual professor perhaps to glom together a curriculum where it would do that. But that's really the basis of it. You can call the course anything you want to, and you can focus on anything you want. But if we're not teaching critical analytical skills, and it doesn't involve writing and reading, I don't think there should be class credit, much less degree programs in the field.
let me just, I agree 100% with that, but it's the same thing in computer programming, right? If you learn to code today, you're going to be irrelevant in 5 years. And so, of course, in computer science programs, you want to learn critical thinking skills, and you want to learn skills that will allow you to maintain a career going forward. But we always talk about sports as if it was something different. And if you walk onto any university campus, you may not even know that they have a computer science program, but I guarantee you're going to know that they have a sports program. So this is where we have this kind of two-faced view of sports. It's something different, but it's core to the university. And maybe instead of trying to think about how do we separate them more, think about how do we bring sports back in.
I would also say we don't dope test the cellist.
Actually,
some places we do.
Actually, yeah, in some places,
if you're a major in music and you perform in concert bands, there's a drug testing.
There's not drug testing, but the use of performance-enhancing substances on the academic side, Adderall and attention, is an increasing problem on campuses, and there has been actual talk of not cellists specifically, but how to deal with that issue.
Talk, but not your policy.
Yeah.
We'll go on. Okay, there was a question right here then.
Hello. First of all, thank you. I'm Anis from the US. I'm a huge Bama fan, so roll tide. One of the arguments I keep hearing in Alabama and all of that is that those very big and strong sports college program actually funds other sports on campus and also other programs. So one piece of the question is basically what share of the entire revenue goes into that? Or do you have visibility in terms of like how much of other sports programs are funded or research program, academic research program are funded through that? Then the other piece for David mainly is regarding the models that you're offering. I mean, football in the South is very visceral. I mean, when you go to the stadium, 100,000 plus people around you, tailgating, you just had a really good barbecue, and you totally forgot everything else, and you have a very visceral connection with the game and with everything else. So, while all of that makes sense from a logic standpoint and when you follow that, how do you envision the implementation and not losing that piece of the culture?
So Alabama, you call it Bama, but for everybody else it's Alabama. Their football program under Saban the last couple of years obviously is an elite program. It's number 1, number 2, number 3 in the nation. So they're in a class all by themselves. They do operate with a surplus. They have an operating surplus on the order of $30, $40, $50 million a year. And that does, in addition to funding Nick Saban's salary and compensation package and his coaches, which together come to about $14 million a year, there's money left over for the other sports. And that happens, as I said, it happens in about 30 or 40 programs. One of the things that gets left out of that calculus, or that discussion very often, is that they're playing in a stadium that has a capacity of around 100,000, as you point out. That stadium was built with capital from the university and from the state. So when you talk about the surplus that they generate, the amortization or the principal and interest payments on the stadium are left out of that. That's a cost that's just been absorbed. And so if you want a real accurate characterization of what the subsidy is that the football program gives to the rest of the university, you have to deduct some of those costs. And I don't know what they are, but they'd be substantially less than the apparent $30 or $40 million.
And then to bring up like the other schools of the world, I mean, obviously, you know, they're heavily subsidized. I'm unaware, and maybe Andy or Roger can speak to this, but I'm unaware of even these schools that earn a ton of money giving back to, say, a specific academic program or paying for a faculty salary. You might often see donations to the library, to the school general scholarship fund. That's typically what an Ohio State does in the years that they turn a surplus. But you know, it's not a grandiose amount. I think last year Ohio State gave like $1 million. Now that sounds great to us, but when you're $120 million budget with a huge surplus, you know, hey, it's nice that they're giving back that token amount to the institution, but they're not funding academic programs and those types of things. I've actually had people tell me that the athletic program pays my salary. That does not happen anywhere that I know of. I know that speaking of Alabama, you know, Auburn actually tried to actually pay for an academic program to be saved that was going to be dropped, but they wanted to save that academic program because it was a place they housed their athletes to get easy grades. So I really don't want athletic departments trying to subsidize academic departments, because then you get into a huge conflict of interest there. And back to the football degrees, I'll just answer real quick on that. I mean, I think that there's certainly a model that could work there. I think it's a great idea, but again, it can't be established as most coaches would think, this is where I'm going to stick every one of my players and they're all going to get easy grades. I don't have to worry about academics. It needs to be a challenging, in-depth academic program, and kids still need to have the choice to choose other majors if they want to. So I see there's some potential problems with that. On implementation, here's, I guess, kind of backward explaining this. It doesn't matter for Alabama or Auburn. I would just pick those two schools since it was part of the question. It doesn't matter who plays, under what model, players getting paid, players being all biochemists. Whoever plays in those uniforms, 100,000 people are going to show up to watch the game. So I think implementation of this is not as complicated as we think. If we would adopt my Model 1, it's really the model that the Drake Group's putting forward, and Andy's put a substantial amount of work into it. So our Model 1, if I could adopt that tomorrow, wave a magic wand and adopt that, that is not going to fundamentally change the tailgating. That's not going to change the attendance. That's not going to change the branding, because people will still show up and watch. Now, we hear from people that, oh my gosh, if you pay college players, the world is going to spin off its axis and the whole system's going to implode. I don't agree with that. I think that if we were able to pay college players, people are going to show up, they're going to watch, they're going to tailgate, and they're not going to worry. In fact, if people are outraged about potentially paying college players, or college sports, quote unquote, not being college sports, they should be outraged right now, because we're not doing what we say. We should not be showing up and tailgating and claiming that we're watching students play sports, because essentially that's not what's happening. So the American public, we're easily able to evolve and adapt. And we would evolve and adapt to any system, and I don't think the games would fundamentally be changed. There might be other options that create themselves, but Alabama and Auburn will always be a hot ticket.
One of the examples of adaptation is with the Olympics. Until Samaranch in the 1980s moved the Olympics from an amateur to professional model, everybody talked about it as, you know, the big amateur sport. And there was discussion, well, if we allow the athletes to be paid in the Olympics, won't that make people lose interest in it? And of course that didn't happen. The Olympics only got more and more powerful and more popular over time. And there are lots of other examples like that as well. But it's interesting that argument is what was relied upon by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in overturning part of the district court's decision in the O'Bannon case. That decision itself is now being appealed en banc, but that's the more complicated legal matter.
Let me just make 3 quick points. I think the discussion of the finances of university sports programs is really important, but it's also really important to put it into its larger context. And I'll just make 3 points about that. One is that many professional sports teams lose money. Stefan Zymanski at the University of Michigan has made this point that in European soccer, particularly in British soccer, teams can lose money for a long time and they never disappear. They don't go bankrupt. So just to cite a few examples, Hoffenheim, Chelsea, AC Milan, they're not financially sound on the open market. And so it's not that unusual that college programs would need to be subsidized, because that's a characteristic of big-time sports. Public universities, in particular in the United States, are heavily subsidized. The government subsidy to public universities, mine is a great example, has gone down tremendously, which meant that the university has to focus a lot more on budgets and making ends meet, which is one reason why there's more discussion of athletics, because it's surfaced how much that subsidy actually is. And it's a valuable conversation because it allows us to have our political debates about what we value. But make no mistake, the universities are heavily subsidized. Inside of universities, money flows in a lot of directions. Several years ago, there was a report at my university that revealed that the Department of Engineering subsidized the law school. Law school lost $5 million a year. And the first discussion from faculty is, well, maybe we should get rid of the law school. They don't make money. And then the response is, well, how can you have a serious university in the state of Colorado without the flagship law school? So maybe we want to subsidize it. So I think revealing that money, the flows of money is really important, but it doesn't tell us what we're going to value. And so that's the discussion we have to have. Just because a program loses money, quote unquote, or is subsidized, doesn't mean it's not something that will find a tremendous amount of support.
Okay, I have to respond to that. It is true that in European soccer you can easily find clubs that are losing money, and it is true in United States professional sports, particularly the NHL and MLS, but in the other sports as well, you find teams that are losing money. That's different. It's different than losing money in an athletics department in an American university. The reason it's different is because the clubs that are losing money at a professional level are owned by multimillionaires or more likely billionaires, and they're making a choice to lose money in the short run because they get a variety of other goodies back from owning the team. They get exposure, which sometimes they just like that on an ego basis, but they get connection with politicians, they can get connections with finance and with CEOs of corporations, they get new business deals to go into, and most of all, they get capital gains. So they might lose 2, 3, 4 million euros or dollars in a particular year, and they might do that for 3 or 4 years in a row. But then they sell the team, and lo and behold, the team value has gone up from 400 million euros to 800 million euros. That's very different than taking resources within a university, a nonprofit university or a public university, and having a big sinkhole there, where $14 million plus on an operating basis alone is being lost year after year. I think it's correct to observe that an economics department, a political science department, a music or an English department, they all lose money, or usually they lose money, because you're paying faculty and you're paying for the buildings that they teach in, and they don't generate explicit revenue. There's generalized revenue from tuition and from government grants and so on. But each department in the university loses money. And so there's nothing about the athletic department that should be different, as long as it's a commensurate and reasonable amount of money. But the economics department at the University of Colorado does not lose $14 million a year on an operating basis. So there does have to be a hard discussion about what priorities are and how resources should be used accordingly.
Can I just... Sorry.
We need to make it quick. People need to be released from their seats. And I need to make a comment about subsidies.
One really quick comment. Sorry, Andrew, I've just got to correct you. There are 92 professional clubs in England. 92. A lot of those don't make money. So, and don't have billionaire owners, believe me.
Thank you. So my plug for subsidy is those of you who have this in your bag, this is the ticket that gets you to dinner tonight. If you are not going to be able to join us for dinner and the big party that happens afterwards, will you please subsidize those of us who could not go and turn your ticket in to the front? And then if you couldn't afford a ticket or for whatever reason you don't have one, maybe there'll be some surplus ones there for you to pick up. That's not me saying that, that's the conference organizers. So yeah, be kind to one another and subsidize each other. Can I thank, please, and can we all please thank this distinguished panel for a fantastic conversation and for your attendance here today. Thanks.
Yeah, exactly. And I was supposed to give some
Let's keep that on.
come in and see Teresa and always say Jennifer. She's still my best girl. I always, yeah, I'd love to do it.